Night of the Living Dead is a 1968 American independent horror film directed, shot and edited by George A. Romero, co-written by Romero and John Russo, and starring Duane Jones and Judith O.D. The story follows characters Ben Jones, Barbra, O.D., and 5 others trapped in a rural farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, which is besieged by a large and growing group of unnamed living dead monsters. The film was completed on a $114,000 budget and shot outside Pittsburgh, where it had its theatrical premiere on October 1, 1968. The film grossed $12 million domestically and $18 million internationally, earning over 150 times its budget. Night of the Living Dead has been regarded as a cult classic by film scholars and critics, despite its being heavily criticized upon its release for its explicit gore. It eventually garnered critical acclaim and has been selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Film Registry as a film deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Quote, Night of the Living Dead led to 5 subsequent films between 1978 and 2010, also directed by Romero, and inspired 2 remakes. The most well-known remake was released in 1990, directed by Tom Savini. Plot: Barbra and Johnny Blair drive to rural Pennsylvania to visit their father's grave. Barbra is attacked by a strange man walking in the cemetery. Johnny tries to rescue his sister, but the man throws him against a gravestone. Johnny strikes his head on the stone and is killed. After a mishap with the car, Barbra escapes on foot, with the stranger in pursuit, and later arrives at a farmhouse, where she discovers a woman's mangled corpse. Fleeing from the house, she is confronted by strange menacing figures like the man in the graveyard. Ben arrives and takes her into the house, driving the monsters away and sealing the doors and windows. Throughout the night, Barbra slowly descends into a stupor of shock and insanity. Ben and Barbra are unaware that the farmhouse has a cellar, housing an angry married couple, Harry and Helen Cooper, along with their daughter Karen. They sought refuge after a group of the same monsters overturned their car. Tom and Judy, a teenage couple, arrived after hearing an emergency broadcast about a series of brutal murders. Karen has fallen seriously ill after being bitten by one of the monsters. They venture upstairs when Ben turns on a radio. While Barbra awakens from her stupor, Harry demands that everyone hide in the cellar, but Ben deems it a death trap and continues upstairs to barricade the house with Tom's help. Radio reports explain that a wave of mass murder is sweeping across the eastern United States. Ben finds a television, and they watch an emergency broadcaster report that the recently deceased have become reanimated and are consuming the flesh of the living. Experts, scientists, and the United States military fail to discover the cause, though one scientist suspects radioactive contamination from a space probe. It returned from Venus, and was deliberately exploded in the Earth's atmosphere when the radiation was detected. Ben plans to obtain medical care for Karen when the reports list local rescue centers offering refuge and safety. Ben and Tom refuel Ben's truck while Harry hurls Molotov cocktails from an upper window at the ghouls. Judy follows him, fearing for Tom's safety. Tom accidentally spills gasoline on the truck, setting it ablaze. Tom and Judy try to drive the truck away from the pump, but Judy is unable to free herself from its door, and the truck explodes, killing them both. The zombies promptly eat the charred remains. Ben returns to the house but is locked out by Harry, eventually forcing his way back in. Ben beats Harry, angered by his cowardice, while the zombies feed on the remains of Tom and Judy. A news report reveals that only a gunshot, a heavy blow to the head, can stop them. Aside from setting the reactivated bodies on fire, it also reports that posses of armed men are patrolling the countryside to restore order. The lights go out, and the zombies break through the barricades. Harry grabs Ben's rifle and threatens to shoot him. In the chaos, the two fight and Ben manages to wrestle the gun away and shoots Harry. Harry stumbles into the cellar and collapses next to Karen, mortally wounded. She has also died from her illness. The ghouls try to pull Helen and Barbra through the windows, but Helen frees herself. She returns to the refuge of the cellar to see Karen is reanimated and eating Harry's corpse. Helen is frozen in shock, and Karen stabs her to death with a masonry trowel. Barbra, seeing Johnny among the zombies, is carried away by the horde and devoured. As the zombies overrun the house, Ben fights off Karen and seals himself inside the cellar, where Harry and Helen are reanimating, and he is forced to shoot them. The next morning, Ben is awakened by the posse's gunfire outside. Upon venturing upstairs, the posse mistake him for one of the ghouls and kill him with a shot to the forehead. Ben's body is thrown onto a pile of corpses which are set ablaze. Cast: Duane Jones as Ben, an unknown stage actor. Jones' performance depicted Ben as a comparatively calm and resourceful Negro, a distinguished gentleman and former university professor. In real life, according to a movie reviewer in 1969, casting Jones as the hero was potentially controversial in 1968. It was not typical for a black man to be the hero of an American film when the rest of the cast was composed of white actors at the time. But Romero said that Jones simply gave the best audition. He was in a few other films after Night of the Living Dead and continued working as a theater actor and director until his death in 1988. Despite his other film roles, Jones worried that people only recognized him as Ben. Judith O.D. as Barbara Blair, a 23-year-old commercial and stage actress. O.D. once worked for Hardman and Eastman in Pittsburgh. O.D. was in Hollywood seeking to enter the movie business at the time of audition. Starring in the film was a positive experience for her. She remarked in an interview. She admitted that horror movies terrified her, particularly Vincent Price's House of Wax, 1953. Besides acting, O.D. performed her own stunts, which she jokingly claimed amounted to lots of running. "I honestly had no idea it would have such a lasting impact on our culture." Assessing Night of the Living Dead, she was just as surprised by the renown the film brought her. "People treat you differently. I'm ho-hum Judy O.D. until they realize I'm Barbara from Night of the Living Dead. All of a sudden, I'm not so ho-hum anymore." Quote: Carl Hardman as Harry Cooper, one of the film's producers. Alongside Striner, Hardman is also the voice of the newscaster heard on the radio of Johnny's car. Marilyn Eastman as Helen Cooper. Eastman also played a female ghoul eating an insect. Keith Wayne as Tom. Judith Ridley as Judy. Ridley later co-starred in Romero's second feature There's Always Vanilla, 1971. Kyra Shawn as Karen Cooper, Hardman's 11-year-old daughter. Shawn also portrayed the mangled corpse on the house's upstairs floor that Ben drags away. Charles Craig as TV newscaster Ghoul. Bill Hinsman as Ghoul. Hinsman was the zombie encountered by Barbra and Johnny in the cemetery. He reprised the role in new scenes that were filmed for the 30th anniversary edition of the film. George Cossana as Sheriff McClelland. Cossana also served as the film's production manager. Russell Striner, uncredited, as Johnny Blair. Striner later served as an executive producer of the 1990 remake of the film, in which he makes a cameo appearance as Sheriff McClelland. Bill, Chilly Billy, Cardiel as a WIIC TV Channel 11 news reporter. Cardiel was well known in Pittsburgh as a TV presenter who hosted a horror film anthology series, Chiller Theater, on late Saturday nights in the 1960s and 70s. Cardiel would later make a cameo appearance as the TV news reporter in the 1990 remake. Production, development and pre-production. Romero embarked upon his career in the film industry while attending Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He directed and produced television commercials and industrial films for the Latent Image. In the 1960s, a company he co-founded with friends John Russo and Russell Striner, the trio grew bored making commercials and wanted to film a horror movie during this period. They wanted to capitalize on the film industry's thirst for the bizarre. According to Romero, he and Striner contacted Carl Hardman and Marilyn Eastman, president and vice president respectively of a Pittsburgh-based industrial film firm called Hardman Associates, Inc. They pitched their idea for a then untitled horror film. A production company, conceived by Romero, called Image 10, was formed, which included Romero, Russo, Striner, Hardman and Eastman. The initial budget was $6,000, with the 10 members of the production company investing $600 each for a share of the profits. Another 10 investors were found when it was found that another $6,000 was required, but this was also soon found to be inadequate. Image 10 eventually raised approximately $114,000 for the budget. Writing, co-written as a horror comedy by John Russo and George A. Romero under the title Monster Flick. An early screenplay draft concerned the exploits of adolescent aliens who visit Earth and befriend human teenagers. A second version of the script featured a young man who runs away from home and discovers rotting human corpses that aliens use for food scattered across a meadow. Russo came up with the concept that they would be the recently dead only because they could not afford to bring long-dead people out of their graves. Or at least we thought. He also came up with the idea that they would be flesh-eaters. Romero decided he liked those two ideas, and without them, it would have been labeled a true rip-off of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend novel. 1954. The final draft, written mainly by Russo during 3 days in 1967, focused on reanimated human corpses. Romero refers to them as ghouls that consume the flesh of the living. In a 1997 interview with the BBC's Forbidden Weekend, Romero explained that the script developed into a 3-part short story. Part 1 became Night of the Living Dead, sequels Dawn of the Dead, 1978, and Day of the Dead, 1985, were adapted from the 2 remaining parts. Romero drew inspiration from Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, 1954, a horror novel about a plague that ravages a futuristic Los Angeles. The infected in I Am Legend became vampire-like creatures and prey on the uninfected. Discussing the creation of Night of the Living Dead, Romero remarked, "I had written a short story, which I basically had ripped off from a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend." Romero further explained, "I thought I Am Legend was about revolution. I said if you're going to do something about revolution, you should start at the beginning. I mean, Richard starts his book with one man left. Everybody in the world has become a vampire. I said we got to start at the beginning and tweak it up a little bit. I couldn't use vampires because he did. So I wanted something that would be an earth-shaking change. Something that was forever. Something that was really at the heart of it. I said, so what if the dead stop staying dead? And the stories are about how people respond or fail to respond to this. That's really all the zombies ever represented to me." In Richard's book, In the original I Am Legend. That's what I thought that book was about. There's this global change and there's one guy holding out saying, wait a minute, I'm still a human. He's wrong. Go ahead. Join them. You'll live forever. In a certain sense he's wrong, but on the other hand, you've got to respect him for taking that position. Official film adaptations of Matheson's novel appeared in 1964 as The Last Man on Earth, in 1971 as The Omega Man, and the 2007 release I Am Legend. Matheson was not impressed by Romero's interpretation, feeling that it was kind of cornball, though he later said, George Romero's a nice guy, though I don't harbor any animosity toward him. Quote, Russo and Romero revised the screenplay while filming. Carl Hardman attributed the edits to lead actor Duane Jones. The script had been written with the character Ben as a rather simple truck driver. His dialogue was that of a lower-class, uneducated person. Duane Jones was a very well-educated man, and he simply refused to do the role as it was written. As I recall, I believe that Duane himself upgraded his own dialogue to reflect how he felt the character should present himself. Eastman modified cellar scenes featuring dialogue between Helen and Harry Cooper. According to lead actress Judith O.D., much of the dialogue was improvised. She told an interviewer, I don't know if there was an actual working script. We would go over what basically had to be done, then just did it the way we each felt it should be done. One example offered by O.D. concerns a scene where Barbra tells Ben about Johnny's death. The sequence where Ben is breaking up the table to block the entrance and I'm on the couch and start telling him the story of what happened to Johnny. It's all ad-libbed. This is what we want to get across. Tell the story about me and Johnny in the car and me being attacked. That was it. All improv. We filmed it once. There was a concern we didn't get the sound right, but fortunately they were able to use it. Although the film is regarded as one of the launching pads for the modern zombie movie, the screenplay itself never uses the word. In fact, Romero would later confess that he felt the film's antagonists were distinct enough from Haitian zombies that they were something completely new, with Romero actively avoiding any similarities between the two creatures, although he notes that he may have subtly been inspired by them. The lead role was originally written for someone of Caucasian descent, but upon casting African-American actor Duane Jones, Romero intentionally did not alter the script to reflect this. Asked in 2013 if he took inspiration from the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that same year, Romero responded in the negative, noting that he only heard about the shooting when he was on his way to find distribution for the finished film. Filming equals principal photography equals the small budget dictated much of the production process. According to Hardman, we knew that we could not raise enough money to shoot a film on a par with the classic horror films with which we had all grown up. The best that we could do was to place our cast in a remote spot and then bring the horror to be visited on them in that spot. Scenes were filmed near Evans City, Pennsylvania, 30 miles, 48 kilometers, north of Pittsburgh in rural Butler County. The opening sequence was shot at the Evans City Cemetery on Franklin Road, south of the borough. The interior upstairs scenes were filmed in a downtown Evans City home that later became the offices of a prominent local physician and family doctor, Allsop. This home is still standing on South Washington Street, locally called Mars Evans City Road, between the intersecting streets of South Jackson and Van Buren. The cemetery chapel was under warrant for demolition. However, Gary R. Steiner led a successful effort to raise $50,000 to restore the building, and the chapel is currently undergoing renovations. The outdoor, indoor, downstairs, and basement scenes were filmed at a location northeast of Evans City, near a park. The basement door, external view, shown in the film was cut into a wall by the production team and led nowhere, as this house was scheduled for demolition. Damage during filming was permitted. The site is now a turf farm. Props and special effects were fairly simple and limited by the budget. The blood, for example, was Bosco chocolate syrup drizzled over cast members' bodies. Consumed flesh consisted of roasted ham and entrails donated by one of the actors, who also owned a chain of butcher shops. Costumes consisted of second-hand clothing from cast members and goodwill. Zombie makeup varied during the film. Initially, makeup was limited to white skin with blackened eyes, but as filming progressed, mortician's wax was used to simulate wounds and decaying flesh. As filming was not linear, the piebald faces appear sporadically. Eastman supervised the special effects, wardrobe, and makeup. Filming took place between June and December 1967 under the working title Night of Anubis and later Night of the Flesh Eaters. The small budget led Romero to shoot on 35mm black and white film. The completed film ultimately benefited from the decision, as film historian Joseph Madry describes the black and white filming as guerrilla style, resembling the unflinching authority of a wartime newsreel. Madry adds, "It seems as much like a documentary on the loss of social stability as an exploitation film." Directing equals. Night of the Living Dead was the first feature-length film directed by George A. Romero. His initial work involved filming shorts for Pittsburgh public broadcaster WQED's children's series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Romero's decision to direct Night of the Living Dead essentially launched his career as a horror director. He took the helm of the sequels as well as Season of the Witch, 1972, The Crazies, 1973, Martin, 1978, Creepshow, 1982, and The Dark Half, 1993. Critics saw the influence of the horror and science fiction films of the 1950s in Romero's directorial style. Stephen Paul Miller, for instance, witnessed a revival of 50s schlockshock, and the Army General's television discussion of military operations in the film echoes the often inevitable calling in of the Army in 50s horror films. Miller admits that Night of the Living Dead takes greater relish in mocking these military operations through the general's pompous demeanor, and the government's inability to source the zombie epidemic or protect the citizenry. Romero describes the mood he wished to establish. The film opens with a situation that has already disintegrated to a point of little hope, and it moves progressively toward absolute despair and ultimate tragedy. Quote, according to film historian Carl Royer, Romero employs chiaroscuro, film noir style lighting to emphasize humanity's nightmare alienation from itself. Quote, while some critics dismissed Romero's film because of the graphic scenes, writer R. H. W. Dillard claimed that the open-eyed detailing of taboo heightened the film's success. He asks, what girl has not, at one time or another, wished to kill her mother? And Karen, in the film, offers a particularly vivid opportunity to commit the forbidden deed vicariously. Romero featured social taboos as key themes, particularly cannibalism. Although zombie cannibals were inspired by Matheson's I Am Legend, film historian Robin Wood sees the flesh-eating scenes of Night of the Living Dead as a late 1960s critique of American capitalism. Wood asserts that the zombies represent capitalists, and cannibalism represents the ultimate in possessiveness, hence the logical end of human relations under capitalism. He argues that the zombies' victims symbolize the repression of the other in bourgeois American society, namely activists in the civil rights movement, feminists, homosexuals, and counterculturalists in general. Post-production. Members of Image 10 were involved in filming and post-production, participating in loading camera magazines, gaffing, constructing props, recording sounds and editing. Production stills were shot and printed by Carl Hardman, who stated in an interview that a number of cast members formed a production line in the darkroom for developing, washing and drying of the prints as I made the exposures. As I recall, I shot over 1250 pictures during the production. Upon completion of post-production, Image 10 found it difficult to secure a distributor willing to show the film with the gruesome scenes intact. Columbia and American International Pictures declined after requests to soften it and reshoot the final scene were rejected by producers. Romero admitted that, "None of us wanted to do that. We couldn't imagine a happy ending. Everyone wanted a Hollywood ending. But we stuck to our guns." The Manhattan-based Walter Reed organization agreed to show the film uncensored, but changed the title from Night of the Flesh Eaters to Night of the Living Dead because a film had already been produced under a similar title to the former. While changing the title, the copyright notice was accidentally deleted from the early releases of the film. The opening title music with the car on the road had been used in a 1961 episode of the TV series Ben Casey entitled, "I Remember a Lemon Tree." That piece of music accompanying each time that George C. Scott's character, a doctor who is secretly a drug addict, is injecting himself with morphine, and is also featured in an episode of Naked City entitled, "Bullets Cost Too Much." Most of the music in the film had previously been used on the soundtrack for the science fiction B-movie Teenagers from Outer Space, 1959. The eerie musical piece during the tense scene in the film where Ben finds the rifle in the closet inside the farmhouse as the radio reports of mayhem play in the background can be heard in longer and more complete form during the opening credits and the beginning of The Devil's Messenger, 1961, starring Lon Chaney, Jr. Another piece, accompanying Barbra's flight from the cemetery zombie, was taken from the score for The Hideous Sun Demon, 1959. According to WRS, we chose a selection of music for each of the various scenes and then George made the final selections. We then took those selections and augmented them electronically. Sound tech R. Lococo's choices worked well. As film historian Sumiko Higashi believes that the music signifies the nature of events that await. Quote, soundtrack. A soundtrack album featuring music and dialogue cues from the film was compiled and released on LP by Varese Sarabande in 1982. It has never been reissued on CD. In 2008, recording group 400 Lonely Things released the album Tonight of the Living Dead, an instrumental album composed entirely of ambient music and sound effects sampled from Romero's 1968 horror classic. Release. Premiere controversy. Night of the Living Dead premiered on October 1, 1968 at the Fulton Theater in Pittsburgh. Nationally, it was shown as a Saturday afternoon matinee, as was typical for horror films at the time, and attracted an audience consisting of pre-teens and adolescents. The MPAA film rating system was not in place until November 1968, so even young children were able to purchase tickets. Roger Ebert of Chicago Sun-Times chided theater owners and parents who allowed children access to the film with such potent content for a horror film they were entirely unprepared for. "I don't think the younger kids really knew what hit them," he said. "They were used to going to movies. Sure. And they'd seen some horror movies before. Sure. But this was something else. Quote, according to Ebert, the film affected the audience immediately. The kids in the audience were stunned. There was almost complete silence. The movie had stopped being delightfully scary about halfway through, and had become unexpectedly terrifying. There was a little girl across the aisle from me, maybe 9 years old, who was sitting very still in her seat and crying. It's hard to remember what sort of effect this movie might have had on you when you were 6 or 7. But try to remember, at that age, kids take the events on the screen seriously, and they identify fiercely with the hero. When the hero is killed, that's not an unhappy ending but a tragic one. Nobody got out alive. It's just over. That's all. Response from Variety after the initial release reflects the outrage generated by Romero's film. Until the Supreme Court establishes clear-cut guidelines for the pornography of violence, Night of the Living Dead will serve nicely as an outer limit definition. By example, in a mere 90 minutes, this horror film, pun intended, casts serious aspersions on the integrity and social responsibility of its Pittsburgh-based makers. Distributor Walter Reed, the film industry as a whole, and exhibitors who book the picture, as well as raising doubts about the future of the regional cinema movement and about the moral health of filmgoers who cheerfully opt for this unrelieved orgy of sadism. Quote, one commentator asserts that the film garnered little attention from critics, except to provoke argument about censoring its grisly scenes. Critical reception. Despite the controversy, 5 years after the premiere, Paul McCullough of Take One observed that Night of the Living Dead was the most profitable horror film ever produced outside the walls of a major studio. The film had earned between $12 and $15 million at the American box office after a decade. It was translated into more than 25 languages and released across Europe, Canada and Australia. Night of the Living Dead grossed $30 million internationally, and The Wall Street Journal reported that it was the top-grossing film in Europe in 1969. Almost 50 years after its release, the film enjoys a reputation as a classic and still receives positive reviews. Review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes retrospectively collected 52 reviews and gave Night of the Living Dead a 96% certified fresh, and it is regarded by many as one of the best films of 1968. In 2008, the film was ranked by Empire magazine No. 397 of the 500 greatest movies of all time. The New York Times also placed the film on their Best 1000 Movies Ever list. In January 2010, Total Film included the film on its list of the 100 greatest movies of all time. Rolling Stone magazine named Night of the Living Dead one of the 100 maverick movies in the last 100 years. Reader's Digest found it to be the 12th scariest movie of all time. Night of the Living Dead was also awarded 2 distinguished honors decades after its debut. The Library of Congress added the film to the National Film Registry in 1999 with other films deemed culturally, historically or aesthetically significant. In 2001, the film was ranked No. 93 by the American Film Institute on their AFI's 100 Years 100 Thrills list, a list of America's most heart-pounding movies. The zombies in the picture were also a candidate for AFI's 100 Years 100 Heroes and Villains in the villains category, but failed to make the official list. The Chicago Film Critics Association named it the 5th scariest film ever made. The film also ranked No. 9 on Bravo's The 100 Scariest Movie Moments. Some reviewers disliked the film's gory special effects, Variety labeled Night of the Living Dead an unrelieved orgy of sadism, and questioned the integrity and social responsibility of its Pittsburgh-based makers. The New York Times critic Vincent Canby referred to the film as a junk movie, as well as spare, uncutted, but really silly. Some reviewers cited the film as groundbreaking. Pauline Kael called the film one of the most gruesomely terrifying movies ever made, and when you leave the theater you may wish you could forget the whole horrible experience. The film's grainy, banal seriousness works for it, gives it a crude realism. A Film Daily critic commented, "This is a pearl of a horror picture that exhibits all the earmarks of a sleeper." While Roger Ebert criticized the matinee screening, he admitted that he admires the movie itself. Critic Rex Red wrote, "If you want to see what turns a B-movie into a classic, don't miss Night of the Living Dead. It is unthinkable for anyone seriously interested in horror movies not to see it." Quote, revisions. The first revisions of Night of the Living Dead involved colorization by home video distributors. Hal Roach Studios released a colorized version in 1986 that featured ghouls with pale green skin. Another colorized version appeared in 1997 from Anchor Bay Entertainment with gray-skinned zombies. In 2004,